guys, Keith here. So it has been way too long since I last did a video walking through the various changes to xLights, and so I'm going to put together, I'm not sure yet how many, but a handful of videos here and go through a number of changes. Now, it's going to be a little bit difficult to necessarily go through them chronologically like I have done in the past, because as I touch on some features, of course, other features are going to be immediately there, and where they are, I will mention them and I won't necessarily come back to them again when I stumble across them later in the release notes. So that means it's going to be a little disjointed. I also plan on sort of, normally I do the videos in an entire take, and it just goes on and on, typically for half an hour to an hour, depending on how many things I need to go through. And this time, I'm probably going to do it a little bit more stop and start, so the video will chop and change a little bit more than maybe it has done in previous videos, but hopefully that will reduce the sort of me faffing around trying to get things set up in order to demonstrate things. So let's get cracking. So before we do, this is, as usual, my show. You can see that I finally did get around to cleaning up my controller tab. I must have been the last person on the planet to get around to it. It was never a priority, but it's all cleaned up now. And like all of you, I took advantage of the visualizer this year and pushed the configurations to all my controllers. And I at least found that it saved me a whole bunch of time, and I hope it helped you as well. So let's start off with some random changes. We'll go back. We're all the way back in 2019, which was May, and it's now December. So you can see how long it's been since I've done regular videos. I did do an X schedule video at one point there, which covered a lot of changes in these releases. So obviously I won't be going over those again. And when I get towards the later releases, there's a few things there that are worth calling out, but that will probably be another video. So let's start off with a grey option on the wiring view. So on the layout tab, if you're in the wiring view, let's choose something vaguely interesting here. So this was David Preem put this together. There's now a right click option. There's always been a right click, but there's now a grey option here rather than just black and white. There's a grey option here. To potentially make things a little easier to view. The contrast is a little bit different. The visualizer's got a whole bunch of updates over the course of this time, and so I will touch a little on that, and I'll try and touch on as many of these things as I can as I go in this time. The visualizer really is the heart of setting up your show. And so the first thing you'll notice if you're not on a current release, there's now a text box down here which will display messages. Essentially, every time you make a change in the visualizer, xLights is away sort of working everything out, trying to recalculate everything, and every now and then it will come across issues which are just not valid and can't be uploaded. And so if it does spot any of those issues, they may well appear down in this text box, and I would encourage you to pay close attention to them, because if you don't address them, you will run into issues when you try to upload them. You'll also notice that there's now the settings here that lets you actually play with the display of these things. So you can make things smaller and larger. You can change the font and the box size. It might help you fit things onto your page. Scott also added the ability to print, but also added multi-page print so that you can print it across multiple sheets as well. He also added the save as CSV. The save as CSV, and I will just quickly bring that file up. So this is what it exports. It effectively just has the ports down the left hand side and all the models listed across. So a simple way for you to get a sheet that you can then print out if you like and take it out as you're plugging everything in, and you can refer to that. But you can also print the image if you would prefer. You will notice on the side here that there are now colored bars that go down here. There's actually two of them. It's not necessarily as visible as I probably should have made it, but the outside bars, or the leftmost bar, is basically grouping together the banks. This one here happens to have an F16, and F16 support banks of 16 channels, and so the first lot are coloured red, the second lot are coloured green, and the third lot are coloured well, the third lot, if I had more than 32, would be coloured blue. And then the groupings for things like dumb and smart remotes are showed as group as 4. And so again, you have the colour bars alongside each group of 4 to give you that visual indication that these things are related together. If we made these boxes a bit bigger so that it goes off to the side of the screen, now when you scroll across, you'll notice that the ports themselves don't scroll across, so you don't lose where you're at particularly if you've got a long line of serially attached devices or models on a law boxes, etc. Sometimes you would get way over to the right and you would lose track of where you were up to on your serial ports. So that now anchors itself in place, so as you scroll across, you don't lose track of where you're up to. So that's there. There's also been a bunch of enhancements here. There's some additional properties which are now displayed in these tooltips. None of these have it here. This one here has got a description, so you can see there's a description down there. I tag my things with cable ties, and so I've put in the description, the model description, the number of cable ties that are on that cable, and you can see it now in the description. There's also been a few enhancements over here on the port side, so you can see it now. We'll try and estimate the current draw. So it's estimating the current draw on this pixel tree at being 9.9 amps. That's done based on knowledge of the brightness, so it knows that this is only at 30%. It knows how many pixels are attached to it, and it estimates the pixel draw, current draw at I think it's 0.055 amps per pixel, and that kind of multiplies out. So if I was to come to this tree, so we said that was 9.9 amps, if I was to come into here and set the brightness, or actually let's just clear the brightness, set it back to 100, right, and now I come here and you can see now it's drawing 33 amps because it's now at full draw. So clearly I'm not going to be able to power that without power injection. Not that I could have powered 600 without it at any rate. But yeah, that sort of thing's in there as well. There's also been a lot of work to do to try and get the start channel here to always be accurate, so that if you are manually configuring your controllers, you can refer to these tooltips to know what a universal start channel to set on your controller that you're manually configuring. So yeah. And obviously you've got the pixel count here. So everything you would need to manually configure your controller is visible here. So even if you're not pushing the configuration to the controller, you can still get some value out of the visualizer in helping you get your show set up. There's a couple other things. There is now a right-click menu here, so I can come over to this port, right-click, and I can now move all the models. So all of these things currently on port 9, I can move them all at once to port 10, and it will move them all down. That's useful particularly if you've gone and set all your models up down here on serial port 1 and you have 30 models and you want to move them to serial port 2, you can just right-click and move them. It makes life very easy. There's also remove all models from ports. So if you get down here and say, well, actually, no, I'm not going to have any of these on my controller, rather than going and dragging them all over to the right, you can just come into here and say, remove all models from the port, and it will just take them all off and move them over to here, and saves you a whole bunch of clicking and dragging. Just trying to make your workflow a little bit quicker. There's also a remove all models from the controller. This effectively just resets everything, takes all of the models off every single port on this controller, which is a pretty drastic thing to do. But if you've got it all wrong, we've seen a few situations where people's controllers were so messed up, it was actually easier just to clean everything off and fix it up. There's also been a number of fixes to some of the anomalies that would occur when you were dragging and dropping things across. So hopefully you won't see as many situations where models just randomly disappear because typically they've got overlapping channels, and the visualizer does not allow models with overlapping channels to be represented here on the left hand side. That's the most common reason that things go away. If I go to this one here's got a couple of things down here. So this is worth noting. So if I drag something over to here, you'll notice that that this here has got now a pretty big jump between this particular output and this output. Let's imagine that this really should have been on output 2. So sorry, channel 2, which I can do. I can set the channel here to be 2, and life's good. It's now, well, it would have been good, except it's not good. It disappeared. Okay, the reason that disappeared was because actually this one here uses up channel 2. So when I set it to channel 2 here, it actually immediately overlapped with this one, and so it bailed. But let's imagine I wanted to set this to channel 4, which is what it should be. Now I do have two options. I could drag this over to here and drop it here, and it will update it to channel 4, but this stays as it was. The other thing that I can do here is I can right click on this one. Let's say I now wanted this to be channel 4. I can right click on this and set it to channel 4, which is great. It's now on channel 4, but now I have a problem that this is still not set on the next available channel, which is a bit of a problem. If I did want to cascade them all, I can come in here and say set on channel and chain. And if I set that to 4, it will basically make sure that these things are all chained immediately onto the end of the previous model, so I don't have to go back and do that manually. So that's also a productivity improvement when you're working with serial channels, because this situation actually happens remarkably often. I've been a little bit surprised at how hard people find to drag and drop models and get them in the right place. The only thing I can recommend is pay close attention to the blueness. When there's blue on the port, that means it's going to be dropped at the end of whatever is there. So if I drop it here, it's going to drop it onto the end. If I drop it here, it's going to drop it onto the end here. If I drop this here, notice how it's blue, then this unusable output is going to go to the end. That's how it works. If I drag something over and it's lit blue on the left or the right hand side, it will insert the model immediately prior to this model, or in this case immediately after this model, in this case immediately before this model, and then it will adjust everything as necessary to make that true. So pay careful attention to where you're dropping things in order to make sure that things actually end up where you want them to be. So that's the bulk of the changes of visualizers. I'm sure I've missed some things, and no doubt I'll stumble across them in the release notes, and we'll come back and we'll cover those. But that's a lot of the changes to the visualizer over the last few months. So the next change limits the list of vendors to those that support the controller type. So here we've got largely Ethernet controllers, and so all of the suppliers here are suppliers who support essentially the Ethernet protocols, be that E131 ArtNet or DDP. If I was to add a USB controller here and come over to the vendor, you'll notice there's a much smaller list of vendors here, because these vendors have controllers which are serial controllers that we recognize. Some people may have noticed that we don't have all controller types here, and that's really not anything special. We don't ask the vendors for anything when we include their controllers here. It's just a question of, do we have enough details about a controller in order to create the configuration file that describes the controller? So if you sell a controller which is not in the list that you would like to see in the list, or if you use a controller that's not in the list that you'd like to see in the list, feel free to reach out to us, and if you can answer a bunch of questions around the capabilities of the controller, we can start to produce it's actually just an XML file to represent that controller, so that you and others can take advantage of some of the rules that get then applied to that controller to validate things as you're working with your controller. So that's that one. All right, so rotate the wiring view. So this, again, this was a David Priam enhancement. And so if I right click here and bring up the wiring view, David made it possible for you to rotate the wiring view, 90 degrees. I think you can just keep doing it. Yep, you can. You just keep rotating it. So if you'd prefer to see it rotated landscape, if that prints better, etc., then, or it's just easier because that's how you want to push it in, you can now rotate that wiring view before you do it. Okay, so we're at 2020-21. So 2020-21 was when we introduced the Gilbert Engineering models download. So in the model download, there's a number of vendors. Now, the vendors do sponsor their participation in this, and Gilbert Engineering decided to get their stuff included, so here it all is. Now, something that people don't necessarily understand is while we obviously do provide the basis for them to be included here, everything underneath this heading is effectively provided by the supplier. They host a file on one of their websites, we point at that file, and when you click on the model download, it actually reaches out to that vendor's website and downloads all of the details about the models that they choose to provide here. This also allows them to provide all of the wiring diagrams. So there's no xLights involvement in building all of the X model files for their props or choosing to list or not to list their props. That's entirely on the vendor. And so if there's something missing that you'd really like to see included, or if you have an issue with a wiring layout for a model that's been provided, we strongly suggest you reach out to your particular vendor and ask them to update the materials. You can also choose to enable or disable. So if you only ever buy from Gilbert Engineering, then you can make this thing load a little bit quicker by going to the Boscoyo Studio and disabling the download, and obviously vice versa. You can see here that these DMX fixture libraries, which are quite large, are automatically disabled by default. If you happen to want to access them, you can come in here and undisable this, and then you'll have to close and reopen this, and it will go and download that fixture library next time you do. It takes a little bit longer for this dialog to load the more of these that you open up. So let me go back. I don't particularly want mine to be disabled. Verge, okay, so this is a Dan Culp change. So this was on the visualizer as well. So I will quickly duck back into there, but this really only applies to the Culp controllers, well, the FPP-based controllers. Normally when you're in the visualizer, when you're using something like a Falcon, and if I was to come in here and to say that this is on the smart remote A, and this is on, oh, I must pick B, this is on A, right, this one's on C, and so forth, you'll see that it breaks them up and puts them onto separate rows to show that they're going to be on separate virtual strings. Dan didn't want to see it this way, and so he created an option. So if I instead said this was a xLights controller, and I chose, I don't know, an FP32B, and I clicked on the visualize, you'll notice that the color coding is kept, but Dan keeps them all onto a single line. This is a choice that he's made, and it sits inside a configuration file, which causes that to be displayed that way. So that was that change. Auto build of the Linux builds also came in 2020-21. You'll notice that if you happen to be a Linux user, that the new builds of xLights pretty much get published about 45 minutes after the Windows version goes out. When I tag the release, Chris has an automated build that does the full build and distribution of the files. So that's fully automated. And I think Dan's got some automation going on as well, but he's obviously got the Apple Store that he has to deal with, so I don't know how far that goes in terms of automation. Add model group import from other RGBFX files. So adding the ability to bring in models from other RGBFX files has actually been there for a while, and you do that by this import previews, models and groups. And what Scott's done is he's added the ability to bring in model groups as well as actual models. And so if I go to another show folder here, I'm trying to remember which one has something interesting in it. This one might do. This one here has a whole bunch of model groups which I can bring in. Now, you will need to have the underlying models as well. So typically you'd want to bring the group in along with its models. If you want to bring a group in, I don't know, maybe you've already imported the models previously, you can bring the group in, but make sure you include empty model groups. That way, if there is no actual match to any existing models here in your show, the group will still come in, it'll just be empty, and then you'll obviously have to manually add those models into it. So when you click OK, this is the pixel poles. It complains because there were no actual pixel poles, but the pixel poles group here exists. So it's all good, and now I could go and add everything in. So maybe you've bought a sequence, they've got a whole bunch of groups, you want to create those groups in your show, and then you want to move all your models into it. So this is a way that you can do that, and then just move all your models in. Now, while we're here, I may as well also show you the filter that's been added here. So let's imagine that I did want to add pixel poles in. In my case, I think I call them sticks. So if I type stick in, you can see now it brings up all the models which contain the word stick somewhere inside it, including submodels up here. And so I can grab these and drag them across and put them in. If I want to clear the filter, I just click the X and the filter goes away, and I can bring up bicycles or whatever, and just makes it a lot easier to find all of your models, particularly if you've got large numbers. A quick way to find those models and move them across into it. Now, while we're here, there's also in the download, so if we come over and download, and let's go and grab one of the larger models, which comes with a bunch of submodels included in it. So in this case, we'll go for the Gilbert Engineering Mother of All Wreaths. There it is, and we'll insert it. Now, the thing that's interesting about this model is it included a bunch of groups. And so if I come up here and I look in my groups, you can see that there are these GE groups, and there's some quite interesting patterns that they've submodeled out using that. Now, if I was to bring in another one of these wreaths, we'll download it again. And again, we'll go down to the wreaths and we'll grab another Mother of All Wreaths and we'll insert it. I get this dialog here, and so what it says is, well, that model group that I'm just trying to import already contains a bunch of model groups which already exist in my layout because I've imported the previous model. And now I get a choice. I can either create a second set of groups, which will be, and let's do that. So let's say no here. And so what it will do is it will add a second set of groups here with the _1 on it, which contain the models from the other groups. So now I've got two sets of group that look similar. And that's useful if you want to sequence them independently and you don't want to mix the two up. But you also have the option of mixing them up, and so blending the two things together. And so we'll do that again. We'll go back to the wreaths and we'll download the Mother of All Wreaths. We'll insert it again. And this time we'll answer yes. And so what it's going to do this time, if I go back to those groups, you'll see it hasn't created an _2 because it didn't do that. What it did instead was it added them into this group here. So these diamonds, this was the original model that was inside that group. You'll notice that the diamonds over here on this model are in the same group. And when you look down here at the details, there's my original wreath, but now number 3 is also there and all of the diamonds are in that group. So you have the option as you download these models and import them to decide how you want to do things and which groups you want things to appear in. So that's that change. Okay, let's go back, controller tab. So on the Falcon controllers, it was actually in 2020.22 that I added this full xLights control. This is only available, I think, on the Falcon controllers. I don't think I've made it available on any of the others. We may do in the future. Previously, with the upload to the Falcon controllers, what it would do is it would reach out to the Falcon controller, download the existing configuration. It would then look at the configuration that it wanted to upload, and let's say you'd put a prop onto port 1, it would then update all of the settings of port 1 to match your prop. But if you didn't have a prop on port 2, but then you had a prop on port 3, it would basically just copy the existing configuration for port 2, and then it would update port 3, and then it would push it back to the controller. And that meant that anything that you already had on port 2 would be untouched. And that kind of makes some sense if you've got some configuration that you really desperately need to manually configure because you can't configure it in xLights, but you'd still like to take advantage of the ability to upload to the controller for everything else. The challenge with that is it can leave some crap behind if you don't need it, and it can cause some issues. So you can run into issues where your prior configuration had the board set in an expansion port mode and you had 600 pixels on port 27, and now you're trying to run 800 pixels on port 1, and you don't really need all of that rubbish in the higher ports anymore because you're now just going to run the controller without an expansion board. Well, by selecting full xLights control, xLights will effectively reset all of those strings configurations back to their original defaults. In fact, it actually sets them back to their minimum values. So, 1 pixel or 0 pixels on all of those ports, and just gets the configuration exactly the way it would be in xLights. So if you don't ever have an issue or don't ever have a requirement to go and update the configuration on the controller manually, then I would suggest you choose full xLights control. And quite frankly, if you can get away with it, I'd also recommend you use the auto layout models and auto size. And at that point, you can just forget about universes and channels because xLights is going to deal with it all as long as you can represent everything in that way. There's been a number of changes to this right-click menu over the last year with the abilities to clone a group, rename. You've always been able to rename and delete, but you can now clone a group, which will take that group and create another group with exactly the same contents. So you can come into the second group. Maybe you want to tweak some of the models. Maybe you want to change the center or change the grid size or the default layout mode, etc. So it's a quick way to just produce multiple groups that are quite similar. Maybe you've got a whole house group and now you want to create a whole house group without your matrix. Well, you can just take your whole house group with your matrix, clone it, and then strip the matrix out, and now you have a whole house group without your matrix. There's also down here the ability to copy models in. So we can copy models in from, I don't know, the All Icicles group. And so it will add the models in. It won't bring the group itself in, but it will copy the models in from that group. This is the change that Scott made. You can also sort them by the name, and you can also clear it, which will just remove all the models from the group, which is kind of the same as selecting it all and clicking the left arrow. So some right-click options just to make editing these things a little quicker to work with. Add the ability to export and load subbuffer definition. So now we finally get to something in the sequencer. So if you're, let's get down here. I don't know, let's go to one of these trees. It doesn't really matter what we put on it. So if you've got a subbuffer over here and you customize the subbuffer in some way, maybe you resize it or move it or something, you can now come in here, and if you click edit, you can now save. Oh, you can click here and go new. You can give the buffer a name. And then you can save that subbuffer. And then at another time, you can drop another effect down, and if you right click here and go to edit, you can come in here and you can choose Fred and apply it, and it will reload that subbuffer. So you can create a library of these subbuffers that you would like to use if the inbuilt ones, the halves and thirds and quarters, etc., aren't all of the ones you'd like to have. It just gives you the ability to access some more and reuse them that you may not previously have been able to do. So that was a change that that was a change that I brought in. Back in 2020.23. Bulk edit support on the morph quickset button. If you've dropped down a few morphs here and you select them, so you've got multiple selected, you can now come down here and bulk edit and do a quick set on multiple. Previously, you couldn't bulk edit this. You could apply this quick sets, but you had to do them one at a time, or obviously you could bulk edit the individual settings. Now you could actually bulk edit the quick set and reset all of your effects along that way. Move all the subfolder settings into preferences. So it used to be up here there was a button which enabled you to change a number of folders. Those have now all moved into the preferences dialog. So the backup directory, or the alternate backup directory in this case, is set here. The backup directory itself is set here. And in the sequences folder, the render cache folder is now set here, and the FSCQ folder is now set here as well. So all of those custom folders are all inside the preferences dialog. There were a couple other changes in here that are worth calling out. He says, now trying to remember where they were. Maybe they were just on the other. Maybe it was. So there's a couple options down here. One is these link save and link controller upload. I really think people should set these, but if you don't want to set them, you can leave them as none, which they will be by default. If you choose the link save to controller and layout tab, that means when I click the save button here on the controller tab, it will also behind the scenes save the layout tab, and vice versa. If I click the save on the layout tab, it will also come over and click here and save on the controller tab. And this became kind of sensible as people started to use the visualizer more and more, because when you're using the visualizer, it's actually making changes on both tabs as you drag and drop things around. And so you'd come out of the visualizer, and the first thing that you'd want to do is save, and then you'd have to go to layout and click save again. So this, by linking them together, you just have to click save in one place and it will save both. Linking the controller upload, for those controllers that have a separation of input and output upload, again, as people have worked towards a situation where they really are able to upload everything to their controllers all the time, then linking the upload of inputs and outputs together kind of makes sense. And in this case, what happens is it doesn't matter which button you press, it will always upload both inputs and outputs, and it will always do them in the right order, because you always upload inputs before you upload outputs. So those changes are also here. It was also in 20.23 that we changed the file name extension for our sequences to .xsq files. So when you do a open here, it shows these xsq files, which are now file name associated with xLights. To be honest, look, it's not such a big deal, but it does help solve an issue where, and it's still true at the moment, the XML files still appear in this list, but sometime in the new year we will actually be changing the default here so that it doesn't show the XML files. We've definitely seen people screw up particularly their RGBFX files by accidentally opening and saving that it as a sequence, or trying to save it as a sequence, and just losing their show setup and having to go to backups, assuming that they actually managed to get help before they went and did more damage. So by making them XSQ files, I'm hoping that it's a little bit easier. You get the nice icon, they're a little bit more obvious. The actual format of the file, has not changed. These things are still the old XML file formats. It's just the extension that's changed to make the files more distinct. Okay, it was also in 2020.23 that we introduced the temporarily changing of the show folder. And I think I made a video back when this came out, because this was really done because we would watch people attempting to import shows or do backup recoveries, and what they would do is they'd go and change their show folder to their backup folder or to the folder that they've downloaded from the particular sequence that they were trying to import, and then they would basically get themselves lost and they would lose their original show folder. And so the power of this is if you click on change temporarily and you change your show folder to, in this case, this show folder here, and we'll discard that sequence because we don't really care, and we definitely don't want to change my layout. You can see that it comes up here with the show folder now in an ambery type color. It now says restore to permanent here, and I can see the layout of the house that I've been working on. I'm not even sure whose house that is. And so I can do, I can load a sequence, render it, save it, do all of the usual things I would need to do on an import. And when I'm done with it, rather than clicking on change permanently and going back to my show folder, I can just click on restore to permanent, and xLights will remember where my show folder was and automatically take me back there. And so we're hoping, and I think it's largely true, that we have seen a reduction in the number of people who have got their shows screwed up as a result of forgetting where their show folder was. All right, moving on. We're now in June. We're in 2020.24. Some changes to the custom model editor, and there's been a few changes to the custom model editor, and some of them I'm going to immediately leap at, and some of them I'm going to probably get a little lost in. So there's been a number of changes in the custom model editor. There's been some additional things here. So I did add convert to single node. So this has obviously been set up as a pixel prop. So it goes with the numbers from 1 up to 51. I think it finishes at, or 57 maybe finishes. But let's imagine that I was pushing, I don't know, a dumb string into this, or pushing in, just old school LEDs into this thing. Then obviously I would need to go through and change all of these numbers to ones, and that's what this convert to single node does. It just changes everything to a 1. And so I've now got a dumb prop or a dumb RGB prop very quickly and easily. The second change that's been made is, let's imagine that this was actually a 3D prop. Maybe I've taken a photo of it and I've mapped all the pixels, and now I want to push the pixels back into 3 dimensions. So one of the ways in which you can do that is you obviously want to move these pixels back a layer. And so what I've done is I've added some keyboard shortcuts. So the first two are F4 and F5. So F5 will push it back a layer, so that 28 is now slipped back here, and I can press it again and it will slip back to here. And F4 will bring it forward, so it's moved it back here and back here. Now you'll notice that it doesn't actually follow it, so it's useful, if I want to push all of these center pixels back, I can just run around pressing F5 to push them all back. Now, what instead you may want to do is you may want to follow the pixel. And so for that, there's F7 and F8. So if I press F8, 24 will jump back a layer and it will move back a layer with it. So I can push it all the way back to the back layer and follow it, and all the way back. And of course I can bring it forward again by pressing F7, and again it follows the pixel. So F4, F5, push the pixel but don't follow it, and F7, F8, push the pixel and follow it through the layers. So a way to make it easy, a little bit easier to change your props and move pixels around in 3 dimensions. And obviously don't forget down here, this modeled picture down here is actually visible in 3D, and so you can spin it around and you can see that there's actually a little bit of depth there to those pixels. When you click on a node, it does highlight it so you can see it. But once you click down here, of course, it unhighlights it. So yeah, there's that. There is also a clear cells. This is something that Scott added, which will just clear all the cells. You select everything and right click and say clear the cells, and it clears them. So this one's a rotation offset on the pinwheel effect. So if I get the speed of this down to 0 so that it's stuck in time, it looks distorted because this is a tree, so it is a little bit distorted. There's now an offset which enables me to effectively set the default position, and this could be useful if I was going to have another layer below, and then I was going to drop another pinwheel on it below and drop its speed to 0. And I can set its offset. So you can see how you could have multiple layers with slightly different offsets at different colors and things like that, maybe running at a different speed or in a different direction. Add an optional second outline to face definitions. There was actually a few changes that are here. So this is one that Scott introduced to our face definitions. So let's click on one of my faces here if I can get one. There it is. So if we go into faces here, there's now actually 2 face outlines. So I could, for instance, have a left half and a right half, and these would come through as a separate color choice to allow me to sequence them slightly different. And the classic use for this is for those standing or hanging bulbs where you might want the base of the bulb to be different from the bottom of the bulb. So you've got these 2 outlines here. There was also eyes open and eyes closed. That we actually broke these into 3. So there's eyes open 1, 2, and 3. And this enables you to create, you might have filled in eyelids, or, you might have 2 slightly different ways in which you want to represent it. Maybe you want to have different colors for different sections. Now, when eyes are open, all of these 3 will be shown. But if you are using the Force Custom colors, it would, of course, use those custom colors at the same time, and obviously you also have access to these to sequence them individually. So yeah, there's a few extra properties on the faces there. Okay, so now we're in 2020-24, and this was where all of the multi-select in the tree. So you've always been able to multi-select over here. But David introduced the ability for you to come over here and multi-select here. And this can be really useful because when you're over here and you're trying to multi-select, if I want to select these presents, it's always complex because sometimes the arches come up and sometimes they don't. And it's just a real pain in the backside. And so David's allowed the ability for me to come up here and holding the control key down, or when I'm selecting several in a row, I can hold the shift key down. I can just select those models up here, which makes this a lot easier to use, particularly when you've got things that are slightly separated in space, etc. It can be a lot easier to do. He's also added many of the right-click options that you would otherwise right-click over here for are now available here as well, which makes a lot of sense. So the align, distribute, resize, lock, unlock, etc. are all up here as well. I think, and I can't remember which release it was, but I'm pretty sure it was post this release. There was also changes here around adding empty groups versus creating a group from the selections. So using the selections here, I can go and create a group from it. I can also take these 4 and add them to an existing group. So I can say I'm going to add those to all arches, and so it will take those presents, and here's my all arches group, and now the presents are in the all arches group. So a few things that let you work with a list when the list is more convenient versus trying to work with the visual layout when it's not. So that was all in 2020-24. Add support for audio shaders. Now, audio shaders are kind of cool. I'm going to have to find one now. I'm also going to have to create a sequence based on an audio file. Is there an audio file in here? Oh, yes, there is. I'm going to use the talking trees because that way I'm less likely to get a YouTube hit. So if I've got an audio file and I'm using a shader, some of the shaders, not many of them, but some of the shaders which you can download here have actually got audio support. Oh, and Dave, was it David or Kevin? Yeah. It was Kevin. Sorry, it was Kevin who did this. So Kevin came up with these audio shaders, which are effectively shaders that are smart enough to refer to the audio when they're running. And so you can see here, this is on all my pixels, etc. And it's actually responding to the intensity of the audio and showing, in this case, some sort of waveform that reflects the audio intensity at that point in time in the sequence, which is kind of cool. And you don't need to do anything fancy to link it up. It's smart enough to know that it should look at the audio track and take its guidance from that. There's an amplitude thing here. Maybe you need to bubble that up a bit. Anyway, so that's audio shaders, which are kind of cool. Okay, so one of the other changes we made was to support shaders that support events. And so the lightning flash is a classic example of this. So when you install this shader, absolutely nothing happens. But you can see that there is a property down here pointing at the timing mark. And so if I come up here and put a timing mark in, and then I play this, well, it would help if I click on the effect so it re-renders again. And when I play this, you can see when it hits the timing track, I don't know if you saw it, it was very brief, but there was actually a flash of lightning, and that's because that flash is actually triggered by the timing mark. So if I want to put in lots of flashes, I can put in lots of timing marks. And when I play it again, and I set the audio really low, you can see it flashes. Nope. Need to re-render it. So now when we play it, it goes flash, 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 along with each of those timing marks. So yeah, so there's not many shaders around that support those, and hopefully we'll find more over time, but this does give you some support for some additional configuration of shaders. Okay, advanced RGBW conversion. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit hard to show, but I will talk you through it. So we have some time now, and I'm just choosing a random model here, not anything in particular. So under the string properties, we've always, or for some time now, we've supported these various flavors of RGBW or WRGB nodes, which are great. Except when you've got RGBW nodes, you've got to recognize that at the end of the day, xLights is really just an RGBW sequencer. So you've got to decide how you want to treat the white channel on those pixels. And so this color handling is what governs that. And by default, it's set to R equals G equals B leads to W as the setting. And what that says is when the red and the green and the blue all have the same value, then turn off the RGBs and turn the white on to the appropriate level of brightness. So for instance, if the red, green and blue were all 40, then it would leave them as 0 and turn the white channel on to the 40 level, which would obviously display white. Now, if it was 40, 40 and 41, then it would turn off the red, it would turn on the red, the green and the blue and leave the white off. So that's the default color handling when you set a RGBW pixel. But there are some additional types here. So white only was one that Scott added. And so what this is going to do is just show the white channel value. It'll look at the red, green and blue, and it will pull out the white, and it will only display the white element. There is also this advanced color handling, which is the one I put in. And what this does is it actually takes the amount of commonality across the pixels out and puts that onto the white channel and leaves the distinctive color on the red, the green and the blue channel. So for instance, if you had 128 on red, 255 on green and 255 on blue, then it would put the white channel at 128 because all of them have 128, and then it would put 128 onto green and blue, and so you would get more of a pastel color than you would normally when you use the default channel number. Now there is some additional color handling in that means that those values might not be exactly precise, but that's the spirit behind what the advanced does. So I would strongly suggest that people that are going with these sorts of pixels try the various color treatments out here, because you may find one that you prefer, and you may even find situations where you want to use slightly different ones, in which case using shadow models might be a way to get the best of both worlds. Value curves on the video effect crop settings. Okay, so strongly suggest you do not do this, or at least if you do it in the absolute bare minimum of situations, because this is going to be slow. Where's my matrix? There's my matrix. So on the video effect here, you have this ability to crop a video sort of left, right, up and down, and that basically allows you to choose a small portion of the video that you want to show. You now have value curve settings here that you can set, which enables you to basically change the amount of cropping that occurs over the course of the video. So if you want to slowly crop in from the left, you could come in here and set a crop in that changes over time. Now, I will caution you, this is extremely slow. It effectively forces xLights to close and almost reopen the video every frame in order to appropriately resize things. So I would only use this in some pretty extreme circumstances where you really needed a particular effect, because it is going to cause you some significant render slowness issues. So moving right along, add the ability to drop fragment shaders on the effect group from Explorer Finder. So Finder is obviously the Mac platform. So if you happen to be in a show folder here where you've got a bunch of shaders, all this means is if I wanted to grab this shader here and drag it over to xLights and drop it, I can do so, and it will create that shader file and link it up to that particular location and so forth. So yeah, you can do the same thing already with videos and pictures, and even Gladiator files for those people that still use those. You can just drag and drop them directly in from Windows Explorer or Finder if you're on OS X. Right click to select all none in an import dialog. Okay, so again, this is so if we wanted to do an import effects, let's go to my show and choose a song that's got lyrics. Amazing Grace does. So this just means that there's now a right-click menu up here where you can right-click, select all, select none. There's been a couple other changes to this dialog while I'm in here. You'll notice that when we came in, came in that it's already selected a bunch of tracks, but it didn't select new timing. So it's recognized that there is already a new timing, and so it didn't select it by default, but it did select all of the other tracks by default. And the reason we select them by default is most people, when they import sequences, really want the timing tracks, so it seemed to make sense. But if you're importing something for the second time and you've already brought the timing tracks in, you clearly don't want to bring them in again, and so it defaults those to off. You can of course bring them in if you want to. There's a couple other settings that were changed up here as well. There's now this erase all existing effects on imported models. So if you're importing onto, I don't know, my arch tree here, and I've already got effects on that model and I would like to erase them and just start afresh, you can click on the erase and it will actually delete all the existing effects before importing it. If you don't click on erase all effects, it will still try and import them, but it'll only import the effects where they don't overlap with any existing effects, which is obviously a method you may use to consolidate effects from multiple snowflakes onto a single snowflake, etc., if that's what you wanted to do. So yeah, there's that. And Scott also added this option here, and this actually makes a lot of sense. And someone asked me the other day why it's not on by default, and I didn't really have a good answer. When you get a sequence from someone, that person who created that sequence may have had model blending on or off, and it can impact the way the sequence renders. And so typically when you import a sequence from someone, if they had model blending turned on, then you probably want model blending turned on as well. And if they had it turned off, then you probably want to have it turned off as well. And so you can select this import model blend mode, and it will change the model blend mode of your sequence to match the sequence that you're importing from. And that's probably what you want to do. Now, of course, you can manually do this by going up to the sequence settings and changing this allow blending between models. That will just do it automatically on the import. And save you an extra step and save you having to guess what the person did or didn't do, because invariably you didn't look when you opened the sequence up, and so now you've got to go back and look again, and this way you can just copy it in. So it's a kind of cool enhancement. Okay, the next one is the spinner model. Very, very, very minor change to the spinner model. There's now an additional property on the spinner model, which is the start angle. So here I can set this to 5 degrees, and it slightly rotates the model off center, but doesn't rotate the overall model. And that's important, because remember, if you rotate this model and then you go to sequence on it, it will never actually rotate the buffer. Whereas if you set the start angle here, it will actually rotate the spinner in the model render buffer. And so it may give you something that's closer to what you want. You might want to use this if you want to overlay multiple models together, etc. So when you're in the node select dialog down here, there's been a bunch of changes to basically remember where the dialog was, so that when you reopen it, it reappears where it did. It also attempts to detect when it turns out off the screen and tries to bring it back onto the screen, to varying levels of success. And so, yeah, there's been a bunch of those changes. This particular one here, I think Scott did, but those changes have been across a number of dialogues within xLights. Discover, so I can't demonstrate this because I don't have anything set up, but there has been a number of improvements around things like discovery, a number of performance improvements. Dan's made the thing run much more in parallel, so you'll see that Discover is a lot snappier than it used to be. Discover will also do things like, it's actually quite good now at looking into exactly how FPP is used, and will do things like it will recognize that FPP is being used as a virtual matrix, and will bring that back and tag it as a virtual matrix FPP. Dan also added that as an actual controller type. So if you set the vendor to be FPP here, you can say it's a virtual matrix. You can even set auto layout and auto size, and if you put your matrix on it, it will automatically work out the number of channels and all that sort of stuff. So all of that stuff has also been added. I'm going to stop there on this video. I feel like I've been going for quite some time, and even once I edit out all my ums and ahs and checks and writing down bugs and whatever else. It's probably quite long enough. We just reached the end of 2020.26. We've obviously touched on some features that go well beyond that, and I'll try not to double up on them in the next video, but hopefully that gives you a rough idea. That's June 23rd, so that's a couple of months worth of changes, and I'll publish another video shortly covering the changes after that. Thanks guys.